And we are back. All right, we are going through and doing a watch along with National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, or NCMEC's Parent Connect Child Safety Virtual Discussion Series. This one is on keeping boys safer from child sex trafficking. Uh, these are pretty good, thorough, long um, discussions that parents would definitely need to learn from. Uh, I don't know how many parents are going to go through every one of these things, quite honestly, but they are packed with information and definitely something that you would need to use as research if these are topics that are interesting to you. I think maybe something to say is that I'm going through these on NCMEC's site, and they are, it's almost as if they're locked. So you go through number one, and then there's like uh, a little survey, and then number two survey, number three survey. They were done originally over a period of time, and I don't know how that worked out. I don't know how many people showed up to these things or anything like that, but definitely great material, great speakers. Man, I think every one of these things needs to have like a PDF that goes along with it with just the bullet points on them, because it's just packed with information. Okay, we're going to go ahead and give this a start, and I will stop it if I need to. And I hope you learned something from it.
Let's get started. Good evening. Thank you all for taking time out of your busy lives to tune in to our Parent Connect series. This evening's episode is the third of a 5-part child safety series hosted by the National Center for Missing and
You know, I'm gonna go ahead and drop in here before it gets started too hard or too hardcore. People don't realize just how many people are at risk of being trafficked, and they certainly don't seem to understand that this could be happening to their own kids in America, if you can believe that. And then even amongst that, people just can't seem to believe this is happening to boys. And well, it is. But one of the things that's super depressing, as if all of that's not enough, is that when someone is caught up in trafficking, if they are lucky enough to get to get help, what happens is the person that gets help gets put into a shelter, and they receive some type of services. But the problem is that there are no shelters that I'm aware of at this time that are for boys. It's like boys just kind of have to deal with it, and it's not fair or right in any way. But the funds aren't there, and I think that usually starts with awareness. So hopefully, people can see that this beginning of the problem, the supply, these parents either uh, not staying on top of this and talking to their kids and watching out for it, or them not realizing this could happen at all, or even worse, telling them that they just have to deal with it once it's over with. This is it's a horrendous problem. So let's get aware, and let's get going.
Exploited Children, or NCMEC as we like to call it. My name is Lene Holmes. I'm the Director of Case Services with NCMEC, and I'm pleased to facilitate today's conversation on keeping boys safer from child sex trafficking. Joining me are two wonderful contributors. One is my colleague, Eliza Reock, along with our guest, Mr. Nathan Earl. Eliza and Nathan, would you take a minute to share with the audience a little bit about your work with this issue? I'll start with Eliza.
Thanks, Lene. As you mentioned, I work with you at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children as the strategic advisor on child sex trafficking. And I've been working in anti-trafficking efforts in some capacity for about the past 15 years.
All right, we're happy to have you. And Nathan, will you introduce yourself?
Oh, thanks, Lene. Good evening, everyone. My name is Earl, and I work as the principal consultant at Giant Slayer Communications, where we work to prevent violence against boys and men through advocacy, education, and outreach. In addition to having lived experience with human trafficking as a young person, for the past 8 years or so, I've been working directly with victimized and high-risk boys and young men, as well as at the systems level to increase the capacity of communities to better respond to the issue. I also have the pleasure of providing consulting and training services to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, Christie House of Miami, and the United States Department of Health and Human Services National Human Trafficking Training and Technical Assistance Center. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Awesome, awesome. I am so excited to get started with our discussion for tonight. And this is a really, really important one, guys. And so we want to dive right in. But first, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that this evening's topic might be sensitive for some of you in our audience. So please remember to exercise self-care during this discussion. Rely on the supports around you or ask for help if you need it. And always know you can step away at any moment if you need to, just to, gather yourself, because we're going to dive into some pretty sensitive yet really important topics today. So this evening, we're going to focus on exploitation in the context of child sex trafficking. And a common myth that's just out there really sort of worldwide is that females are almost exclusively victims of this form of exploitation. Now, though there's a smaller reported proportion, male victimization numbers are significant, and young men and boys often face other endangerments. So when we think about prevention and awareness, it's really important that families include all genders, regardless of all children, regardless of gender, in exploitation prevention conversations. So first, before we dive into sort of the meat of the discussion, let's dispel some myths that are out there about the idea of child prostitution. We do not use that term at all. And so, Eliza, can you help our audience understand why that term is just inaccurate and really what child sex trafficking is?
Sure. And I suppose this is an example of we do use it when we say what we're not supposed to talk about. But I think to start with, it's really important to remember that child sex trafficking is child abuse. That is consistent with federal definition and the nature of the crime. So when we use terminology like child prostitution or other shaming or blaming language related to the child, we're taking away from that understanding of what child sex trafficking actually is. So by definition, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act says that sex trafficking is a form of exploitation where a commercial sex act is traded, or a sex act is traded for something of value through force, fraud, or coercion. And most importantly to this conversation with NCMEC, or if the child has yet to obtain the age of 18 years of age. So that's really important because we don't have to prove that the child has a trafficker or whether or not they chose to be engaged, because again, this is a crime that's being committed against that child. I think sometimes when we talk about like an adult teacher having sex with a child, we don't have that conversation about agency or choice, but yet somehow because of the unfortunate stigma around the sex trade broadly, there's been a tendency to blame children when it relates to child sex trafficking. And that's why it's really important to shift that narrative.
Absolutely, thank you. And can you talk to us about some of the trends that we see at NCMEC regarding CST?
Absolutely. So last year, NCMEC received over 17,000 reports of child sex trafficking that we responded to. So we have a lot of really good data as far as consistency and trends, but it's also really important before I share that information to talk about what that data does and does not represent. So when we talk about those 17,000 reports, those are cases where children are reported to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. And I think that's particularly relevant to this conversation because quite frankly, I think it's fair to say that young men are less likely to be identified as child sex trafficking victims to start with. So our data can only be as good as the information reported to us. Similarly, most of the children that are reported missing to NCMEC either have some sort of online exploitation component to their commercial sexual exploitation, or they've run away from home and have been reported missing. So if a child's homeless and being exploited while living on the street, or for instance, if they were kicked out of their home due to abuse, or if they are still living in their home and being exploited either by their family members or others around them, but haven't actually gone missing, that might not be represented in our data. So with that caveat, I can share with you that we do know that children who are missing are at higher risk for being targeted by perpetrators. So 1 in 6 of the young people that ran away from their home or placement were likely victims of child sex trafficking at NCMEC. Further, we know that children that are in the care of social services are at a higher risk. We saw around 17% of those children being likely victims of child sex trafficking. And as it relates to this conversation, and I think Nathan, who, as he mentioned, is part of advisory council to NCMEC, made a really good point that when we share this data, we want to be really careful, because we say 7% of the children reported to NCMEC that were identified as child sex trafficking were male or assigned male at birth. I think it's really important, though, to point out that that number, since we started tracking child sex trafficking, has grown from a fraction of a percent to 7%. And so I believe that there's likely underrepresentation of males within our data, again, because of identification reasons, and then also maybe lack of tolerance or acceptance for these types of issues.
Yeah.
So I want to make the point that I just heard her say it went from a fraction of a percent to 7%. And I'm going to rewind that to make sure that I heard that correctly.
To point out that that number, Nathan, who, as he mentioned, is part of advisory council to NCMEC, made a really good point that when we share this data, we want to be really careful, because we say 7% of the children reported to NCMEC that were identified as child sex trafficking were male or assigned male at birth. I think it's really important, though, to point out that that number, since we started tracking child sex trafficking, has grown from a fraction of a percent to 7%. And so I believe that there's likely underrepresentation of males within our data, again, because of identification reasons, and then also maybe lack of tolerance or acceptance for these types of issues.
Sorry about the echo. 7% of reports are for boys or identified as boys at birth. That is an alarming number, and those are just the calls that go into the to NCMEC. It's difficult to know if it's because there's better information about where to make these phone calls, because that's always part of it, just awareness of the ability to do that. But that's alarming.
Yeah, really, really good points. And Nathan, I wanted to ask you sort of a two-part question. What do the numbers look like in terms of males who are trafficked? And secondly, can you speak to our audience about the stigma associated with that and why males may be less likely to disclose abuse?
Sure, definitely. So unfortunately, we all know, whether through force, fraud, or coercion, boys fall prey to human trafficking in various forms across the country every day. There's been several best-in-class organizations that have published research supporting the significant prevalence of male trafficking, with some believing as many as half of all child sex trafficking victims are boys, or would identify as a boy or a male. Of those, the Global Data Hub on Human Trafficking recently reported that 23% of male victims are trafficked into pornography, and these were male minors. With that said, as Eliza alluded to, the data we have is most likely skewed because of the underreporting of labor exploitation and sexual harm against boys. Many believe that this happens far more frequently than previously reported. So how does it show up? Forms of trafficking that affect boys can include both labor exploitation and commercial exploitation in several forms. One of which is more common in my experience, can include the exchange of sexually explicit images and videos for commercial distribution. And again, from my experience, online sexual exploitation or online child sex trafficking is among the most common with male victims that I've worked with. Many times these boys are groomed online by perpetrators posing as women, men, girls, or guys. Predators first begin engaging the boys through various gaming systems, social media sites, and apps. And then once engaged, the predator may send a nude image or video to the child and asking them to send one in return. Once that happens, the perpetrator will threaten to share those pictures on social media sites or threaten to send the images to the parents or friends if the child doesn't keep sending pictures, if the child doesn't send money, meet them in person for sexual intercourse, or engage in live streaming sexual activities. And so what happens is many times the predator then sells or trades those images or videos online or in clandestine networks, including the dark web, for a profit, which qualifies for under the federal definition for child sex trafficking. And again, as Eliza mentioned, there doesn't need to be a third party buyer for this to be child trafficking. It's any commercial sexual transaction with a minor would be a form of trafficking. Equally important, I think, is the common channel for the exploitation of our LGBTQ youth.
Sorry, I have to have this thing muted so that it doesn't give me feedback. He just kind of dropped casually in there that he just dropped in there casually that you do not have to have a buyer to be considered sex trafficking or child sex trafficking. And a little before that, he mentioned that somebody could be taking, they send a photo to a kid can send them a photo back, and then that person making any commercial exchange for that photograph counts as child sex trafficking. I got to tell you, it's the first time I've heard it said that way. I am absolutely certain that he is correct, because this is his job. But I want to hear it one more time just to be sure that I heard him correctly. Yeah, I heard him correctly. Oh, I didn't have his video on. My apologies. Yeah, I heard that correctly. He said that under the federal definition of sex trafficking, it says that if you actually are selling that image, that's considered trafficking. And I got to be honest with you, that's really good news to hear that that does fall under the federal definition. I need to go back in and make sure that I understand exactly how that works. But but wow. Okay, so what I heard was if you are selling, or even it sounded like trading, these images, that is considered child sex trafficking. I am heartened by that, if you can believe it, because we need more ways to stop these people.
And again, as Eliza mentioned, there doesn't need to be a third party buyer for this to be child trafficking. It's any commercial sexual transaction with a minor would be a form of trafficking. Equally important, I think, is the common channel for the exploitation of our LGBTQ youth. This is done many times through the gay dating apps and websites as well. These LGBTQ youth are looking for acceptance and ways to affirm and places to affirm their sexual orientation or gender identity. So they turn to these sites. The traffickers begin grooming boys on these sites. They lure them in with affection, acceptance, even things of value. They fill this emotional gap or sometimes meet the basic needs. The relationship starts out as platonic, or even in the eyes of the young person as a seemingly harmless sexual relationship. And then the relationship then returns or evolves into this exploitative one long before the young person even knows what happened. I think finally, my final point in this question is related to the risk factors. We know, and research supports, that risk factors at the family level, so in your home, can include exposure to domestic violence, the presence of a substance-dependent caregiver, intergenerational trauma, parents living with unaddressed mental health challenges, the absence of positive role models for your son, such as a father figure, coach, a pastor, or a mentor, and all too often, unfortunately, familial rejection because of the sexual orientation or the gender identity of the child.
Okay, wow, we're already like into the meat of our discussion, guys, and both of you just started out with some really just eye-opening points and some eye-opening information for our audience here to think about. You know, Nathan, you brought up the issue around discrimination and how certain groups in our populations may not be as well accepted by society or even within their families. So for both of you, Nathan, you sort of hinted to this, you talked a little bit about this. Can we talk a little bit about why it is important for all children, and specifically for children who are LGBTQ, who are at higher risk for trafficking because of discrimination and because of lack of acceptance? Why should trusted adults be aware of this, and what should trusted adults be ready to do to support the youth that they're in their care, the youth that they are charged with, and those sorts of things? We start with Eliza.
Sure. You know, it's a really important question, and I think that for trusted adults especially, it's important to think through support systems and safety. So I talked about this before with our expert working group and some of the consultants that we have here at NCMEC with lived experience, where based on their feedback, we actually changed some of our own indicators at NCMEC to reflect that very point, is that it's not the child being gay or transgender or bisexual that's putting them at a higher risk. It's really goes to that lack of tolerance for their sexuality or for their gender identity. And so, you know, the fact that parents are part of this group and wanting to be supportive, I already feel like young people in your life may have a step ahead of some of that at-risk behavior, because, you know, as opposed to saying, hey, mom, dad, I'm gay, and the unfortunate truth is that the response could be, get out of my house, you're not welcome here because of that. That if a parent says, thanks for telling me, if you're facing any challenges, let's see if there's a support group, etc., I'm a lot less concerned about that child being targeted by a buyer or a trafficker.
Great point. And we want to do a little bit of, dispelling some myths in this conversation anyway, that boys and men who are victimized are the connection with victimization and their sexual identity. And that is absolutely not true. And that is not that's a myth that's out there as well. Nathan, did you want to chime in on that question as well?
Sure, and thanks, Eliza, for mentioning that. You know, the LGBTQ status, the fact that your child or a child identifies as LGBTQ, is not the vulnerability that's going to lead to exploitation. As Eliza mentioned, it's the lack of acceptance, the lack of resources, the lack of safe shelter if the kid is kicked out of the home because of the family conflict around that. So what we need to know is that child is looking for affection. They're looking for support. And if they're not going to get it at home, they're going to find it online, or they're going to find it elsewhere in the community in dangerous situations. And we know that to be a strong link with that lack of stable supports in the home and later exploitation. But I think to answer your question, Lanai, what should they know? What can they do? I think above all, parents need to be really frank and have really candid conversations with the children or their youth in the home, and let them know how predators operate, how they create these fake personas online, connect with boys to exploit them. Educate your kids that they're not to engage with these personas. Let them know that it could happen, and that it's okay to report to the parent, or if they're not comfortable with the parent, another trusted adult. Even the cyber tip line, right? And I think what's really important for the dads on the line, this is really powerful. Dads, Your son needs to hear from you directly that it would be okay for them to come to you if they were somehow sexually abused or exploited, or someone tried to exploit them. There's that bond between a son and a dad, and many times that fear of disappointing their dad creates a barrier, and those young people don't disclose. They end up being exploited, and thinking that no one is there to trust and love them. And moms, there's always been a special relationship with your sons too, coming from a mama's boy. Those kids need to hear from you directly as well, that there's nothing in the world that can happen to them that would change their love for you, that you will always be there to support them. And I think finally, as parents, speak to the coaches and the pastors in your kids' lives about having these conversations too. I think finally, another way, or an impactful way, that parents can further protect their child is to advocate with your local school. Many communities have child exploitation prevention education mandated by their states. What we need to be sure of is that those prevention education curriculums were designed and tested for boys as well. We know all too often that trafficking happens in schools, or they're recruited out of schools. So just another line of defense for the parents is to really partner with your PTA and advocate strongly that those the curriculum in your child's school is educating your son as well as your daughter.
Okay. So there was a couple of things in there that were pretty important, and every time I thought he'd gotten to a point uh, where I should interrupt, I kept thinking, no, that's another better point, another better point, another better point. So the synthesis of everything that I've learned in this awareness/prevention field is that you need to talk to your kids. And your kids need people to talk to that are outside the family in case something like this is happening inside the family. What he just kind of, rattled off there was that we need to have unconditional love for our children, and our children need to know that we have unconditional love for them. Your kids are never going to become comfortable speaking with you if they don't feel like that connection is there. So we're really talking about, becoming and maintaining um, honest players and honest relationship holders, and open, caring people to the people in our family, and they need to understand that. And it's not an easy task for a lot of people, but this is your role. And again, um, if something like this is happening inside your family that you may not know about, you need to make sure that you have ways for your family to go get help outside. He throws out, pastors and coaches and things like that, but we're talking about teachers and doctors, even neighbors, as long as you trust those people, and that your kid knows that if that kid needs to report something that shouldn't get back to the family, that's okay too. Stranger danger is not the right policy all the time. Okay.
Excellent point. And to that point, I want to turn to a question around some of the indicators of child sex trafficking that actually can be missed if we are only focusing on girls. And we're going to throw out a term here, and I want to make sure the audience understands the term and the definition. We're going to use the term cisgender female and cisgender male. And so for those of you that are not aware of what cisgender means, Eliza, would you please talk with us about what are some of those indicators that can be missed if we only focus on cisgender females versus, like Nathan said, making sure the curriculum is inclusive of all genders and those indicators?
Sure. And Lene, just because you referenced this, that some people may not know what cisgender means, to clarify, I think most people tend to be familiar with transgender identification, which means that when I'm born, how I'm assigned a sex, either male or female. If I identify, or I am male, but I was assigned female at birth. That would be transgender. Cisgender means that I identify with the same sex that was identified at birth. So if I was assigned female at birth and I identify as female, I'm a cisgender female. So just to clarify what we're speaking about there. So we have a list of indicators on our website specifically to child sex trafficking broadly, and as well as our guide for parents and guardians. I think what's important and what was mentioned before is that we make sure that our language doesn't narrow our considerations to just cisgender females. So we've actually, again, because of amazing feedback from consultants like Nathan and others, have revised our language in the past few years to make sure that we're not reinforcing to professionals that could interact or intervene in child sex trafficking that they're only supposed to be looking for transgender females. And I think, you alluded to this a moment ago when we were talking about LGBTQ specific, that we know that may be even more concerned about disclosing potential abuse because they may be identified as gay or transgender. But, that idea of this abuse happened to me and now my masculinity is in question. So really, really important that we're not trying to put a single narrative to what child sex trafficking looks like. So I think if you look at those indicators, they really apply broadly. It's just making sure that when we're framing it, we're recognizing that it isn't exclusive to cisgender females.
Thank you for that. And Nathan's point about parents really advocating with their schools in their communities is so important because I think just as a society, we can get caught up in the traditional way of thinking about these issues, and we can miss so many young people that are at risk. So our charge to all of you on the call today is to take this information back to your communities and to those that are working with kids to talk about the risk across the board. Now, another misconception is that perpetrators are limited to cisgender males. So Nathan, I'd like for you to take this question. Can you talk about some typical examples of female perpetrators as buyers and as traffickers? We're going to bust all the myths tonight, guys, all of them.
That's good stuff, and it's a great question. That is one of the strongest myths out there that creates barriers to identification. And from my experience, working with this population, how this shows up in a community. Well, I'll state one estimate, if you will, by the International Labor Organization that states that globally 36% of all traffickers are females. So again, going back to what we stated about data, we need to really look at the methodology. But I say that to say that women traffic, there's a significant number of female traffickers. When it comes to buyers, how we've seen it how I've seen it show up in communities, unfortunately, familial trafficking is one of the most common forms of trafficking that boys experience. And so in some instances, the family or the mother, the grandmother, the auntie has an unaddressed substance dependency problem. And it gets so bad that they literally trade or sell their son to the drug dealer or to others for a profit to support that drug habit. And other families, poverty, their intergenerational poverty, where it's been normalized that they pick one of the sons or the oldest son to sell for labor or sexual services. And it's many times because the father has been out of the home, whether that's incarcerated or they've left. It's a single mother. The single mother's left with that choice. And then we also have on the, I mentioned a few minutes ago, some of the channels for solicitation or where these boys are being sold. There are the sites that women engage male minors and young men, such as Tinder, Plenty of Fish. These mainstream dating sites, they engage with conversations. The conversation comes up. They look for a vulnerability. And so I think the point here to make is that women and men traffic, and women and men buy sex from girls and boys. And it's the reality. It's not so comfortable to talk about, but that's why we're here tonight, is to put all that on Front Street.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the overarching message that we want to share with you all is when you are monitoring your children's internet activity, we want you to pay just as close attention to your boys and what people are saying to your boy. in the same way that you would to your little girl. And I think that is one of those myths that boys are okay. They're just playing an online game. Oh, they're just chatting. They're fine. But parents may spend a little more time thinking about their daughter online. What we're saying is we want you to pay attention to both, and we want you to pay attention to how people are talking to your boys. So when we talk about prevention, what are those conversations that parents and trusted adults need to have with boys about this topic? And what are some of our best practices? I'm going to switch to Eliza to give Nathan a minute after he just spoke.
Thank you, Lene. I won't try to bust the myth that I'm a terrible singer tonight, maybe another time. But all the other myths we can bust. So I think that I need to start with some full disclosure that I'm not a parent. So I'm playing a little bit of armchair quarterback here. However, I have amazing partners like Lene and our team who are incredibly experienced at working with families who have unfortunately had missing and exploited children in their lives and have created some really amazing resources to support parents when considering how to talk to their children. Some things I can say though, again, I think that when we're thinking about prevention and boys, making sure that you're a safe person that they can talk to, making sure that, you know, if somebody sends them imagery online and they're upset by it or concerned about it, like Nathan said about that kind of sextortion idea is what we call it sometimes, that they're not worried that they're going to get in trouble or be judged by you if they talk about those concerns. So I think some of those healthy boundaries, general concepts to empower that young person to be able to make informed choices, but also to feel safe, again, in telling you when they're not feeling safe, are going to be some of the most important steps you can take in protecting your child.
Absolutely. Nathan, did you have some other words of wisdom to add here?
I echo Eliza's statements. I think with boys, because of these constructs of masculinity and homophobia in our culture, it's very important to reinforce masculinity when approaching your son or a male youth about this topic. We reinforce that masculinity and approach it in a non-judgmental way. Create that safe space, as Eliza mentioned. The reality is that traffickers will use this fear of let me take a step back. Many of these boys will not disclose or are afraid of telling because they think that what happened to them somehow made them gay, or because it made them less of a man. And that manhood within our society is really important, even to a young kid, you know? So I think that's that safe space is when we're talking about this, we really need to be intentional on reinforcing the masculinity piece and dispelling any myth that if a young person was harmed sexually, that it somehow made them gay, and it's just a myth.
Yeah, and I think, Nathan, to your point, in thinking about reinforcing masculinity, that it is okay to reach out. It is okay to say something. That is as celebrated, right? And that ability to say what you need and how you have been affected is something we want boys to feel comfortable doing. We've got actually a great guide at NCMEC on our website, and it's our guide for parents. It's a tip sheet on how to start these conversations. It's a way to give parents a couple of tips on what to look for and what to do to start these conversations with the children in your lives. And particularly, we want to make sure that, one more point that I want to make is that sexuality is something that we are all exploring, and young people are absolutely exploring their sexuality. However, taking advantage of someone is not, that's not appropriate anywhere. So for boys to know and be comfortable with knowing that it's inappropriate to take advantage of someone or to be taken advantage of are also some of the tips that we want parents to know about. So let's talk a little bit about if something does happen to a child in your life, or you're worried about a child in your life. So let's say that a trusted adult or a parent believes that their child, someone is trafficked or has been trafficked, and they notice some of the indicators, or a child discloses. So what are some of the steps that that parent or that trusted adult or even that child can do to get help for themselves? Eliza?
Sure. Well, if you are not the parent in that child's life, I would reinforce that child sex trafficking again is child abuse. So you would want to report it to your child abuse authorities. For parents, again, that conversation, when you're approaching it or when you're trying to learn more or find information, it shouldn't be about getting your child to disclose one way or the other or asking them the why, but really saying, what can I do to keep you safe? You know, we talk a lot about the what's and the whys there. I think finally, if you suspect child sex trafficking in any form, NCMEC's here to help. We have a huge amount of resources available on our website. So any criminal activity, you should of course be reporting to law enforcement, but we also have important information and resources that we're collecting. So please remember to not only report child sex trafficking to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, but be aware of some of the resources that we have available, like our Family Advocacy Division, Team Hope, etc., that can support families that are experiencing this type of crisis.
Great. And Nathan, what about some of the resources that you know about that can help adults kind of navigate this for them?
Sure, absolutely. I think first and foremost, and again, we want to always approach the child in a non-judgmental way, right? Assure them that it's not their fault, because of those feelings, those conflicted feelings around their sexuality or the sexual victimization or diminished manhood. If you, aside from the resources that Eliza had mentioned, the wonderful resources through NCMEC, there is a national clearinghouse of resources called malesurvivor.org. And it is a fantastic resource for both a survivor of exploitation and for, say, families, parents, or providers. Malesurvivor.org, I believe Deb was going to put that into the chat box. Here it is. We've partnered with this organization as far as sharing their information, and we know them to be credible. Fight the New Drug and Pornography Addiction Recovery for Teens. So again, with an American culture, that whole masculinity thing at a very young age, unfortunately, pornography is part of that rite of passage in an unhealthy way. The reality is that boys are encouraged, and schools encouraged to watch, pornography or adult entertainment or whatever term you want to use for it. As it relates to exploitation, a young child being exposed to child sexual abuse material, whether those are photos or images, and many, or in some cases, can create opportunities for hypersexualization or sometimes sex addiction and pornography addiction. And so that's one of the resources that we found helpful with some of the male survivors that we've worked with. It's not talked about a lot, but pornography addiction is a public health crisis in America, and especially with our male teens. The Trevor Project is a fantastic resource for an LGBTQ youth struggling with the coming out process or feeling they don't have any resources. It's another national crisis intervention and support. And then finally, these are two regional providers. One of the challenges today we have is there are not a lot of providers focusing on male youth, but these are two providers in Chicago and then one out of North Texas that we've worked with. They're credible. They have resources. So if you're in those regions and looking for resources, they may be another resource for you to reach out and get localized resources.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nathan. And just so you all are aware, because now we're talking about what if something has happened or what if you are concerned about a child in your life, we have our next episode of Parent Connect on August 10th, which is exactly that. It is an entire conversation about how to support a child and how to help your family heal if exploitation has occurred. So we encourage you to come back in a month and participate in that next part 4 of our 5-part series. All right, so we are winding down our chat for the night. I do want to turn our attention to our audience at home, we've got a couple of questions already in our inbox. And so let's take a minute and answer some of our questions. Eliza, this one's going to go to you. Question about whether there is a difference between sex trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation. Can you explain that difference, or if there is a difference in those two terms?
Sure, there is, and it's very nuanced. I think the person who asked is a child serving professional, so forgive me because I am from DC and we love our acronyms, so clarifying those pieces can be challenging. But CSEC, child sexual exploitation of children, is often used interchangeably with child sex trafficking, but it's actually an umbrella term. So while all child sex trafficking is child sexual exploitation of children, not all commercial sexual exploitation of children is child sex trafficking. So for example, if I were, or maybe not me, because this wouldn't happen, but if a human were to exchange child sexual abuse material, what NCMEC uses as the correct term of formerly called child pornography, if I was to share that image with another person in exchange for something of value, that would be commercial sexual exploitation of children, but not child sex trafficking, because the Sex Act didn't happen for that commercial exchange. That being said, there's clearly a crime being committed in any of those situations.
All right, thank you for that question. There is another question that came in asking if we could go over the way perpetrators lure children. And what I want to say to that one, because I know we're about close on time, is our indicators tip sheets and our fact sheets that are on missingkids.org. Actually, we do have several indicator tips sheets that go over the luring tactics that perpetrators will use. So I'm going to refocus, or I'm going to point you to that.
And the family for parents and guardians specifically talk about
perpetrators. Yeah, absolutely. And so now we are kind of closing in. There's a couple other questions that came in as well. There's a question about statistics of the family giving the child away. What I'll say to that, and I'm going to look kind of to Eliza here and to Nathan, both of them mentioned that what we know about this crime is based on what's reported to us. And oftentimes in familial trafficking, those children are not reported missing. Those children are being victimized within their home. And so this is really an underreported sort of area, I would say. And Nathan and Eliza, would you agree, or would you? Yeah. So we really would not have accurate numbers to indicate that. But the question is still super valid, and what we will say is, for those trusted adults in the community, our school teachers, our medical professionals, our community leaders, we really rely on everyone to wrap around a child. And if you see a child who is in need, is having some issues, that we want those to wrap around that child and to step in and ask questions of that child. Any other thoughts about that particular question, guys?
I just think it's important for parents to know that traffickers can be, parents, a coach, a pastor, a doctor, a teacher. So I think it's just really important to broaden our perspective when it comes to indicators who we should be looking for, and not be fooled by or blinded by this stereotypical, the perfect trafficker, if you will.
Right. Which is, it's hard to wrap your head around. It really is a lot. It's hard information to swallow, but when you're more aware, then we're more able and more capable to protect our kids.
Yeah, and I think just add, I know we're at time, but I think it's a really nice point to remember is, the average age of a victim reported to NCMEC as child sex trafficking is 15. However, that's when they're first identified. But I do also think it's really important that while we recognize that this issue is often sensationalized and can be, we want to make sure we're accurately representing, the priority should always be to believe the child and affirm the child. And even if it's hard to imagine some of these things that happen, if a child's making that kind of disclosure, if you're concerned, there's something going on and it's worth intervening. So I appreciate having the opportunity to reaffirm that point as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then final question as we close out for the day is about what curriculums are out there for kids in schools. And what I'm going to do is plug our internet safety curriculum, our Net Smarts and Into the Cloud series, which is also found on missingkids.org, as great opportunities. We share that curriculum with schools across the country as a part of the curriculum that they put out to help identify abuse within the school system. So netsmarts.org, Into the Cloud, all found on missingkids.org. Eliza or Nathan, you have other thoughts to add there?
Just in addition to that, Love 146 is not a number prevention curriculum. We've worked with them. It's gender inclusive. They do a great job in creating case studies of male youth that have been trafficked. It's really easy for males to identify with, as well as I Empathize, lowercase e, capital E, I Empathize. Those two were recommended or identified when we did a national prevention education review, and we know them to be gender inclusive.
Awesome, awesome.
Yeah, not surprising. I'm sure there's a few we're missing, but not surprisingly, you two rock stars have it all covered as far as from this end.
All right. Well, guys, thank you all for hanging in there with us. You know, we really appreciate you being with us tonight. And I want to just really thank Eliza and Nathan for sharing their expertise and their insight on this very important topic, as we really did, you know, we made it a point to carve out this topic specifically to talk about boys, because we want the public to understand how important it is to take care of our young men and really give space to this conversation specifically for boys. All right, so a couple of other things to mention here. You will be able to find this recorded session at NCMEC Connect online, along with our other trainings. And our child sex trafficking 3-part training is also available to those of you that are interested in learning more, digging more into these particular issues. We value your opinion and invite you to come back to the Parent Connect series to take a survey, to let us know how this information was received, what we can do more of, where you would like more information, and help us craft the messaging that works for the communities that you are in. All right. So we are closing out for today. Please stay tuned to the next Parent Connect. It's going to be July 27th when Ben Allen will talk with our NCMEC's Brittany Perna and Detective Mike Hochwarner of the FBI's Child Exploitation Task Force about digital boundaries in youth sports and activities. So until then, be well, stay safe, and good night, everyone. We really appreciate everyone taking the time to be with us today.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, so that was keeping boys safer from child sex trafficking. I learned quite a bit from that, some things that were scary, but I know we talked about them as we went through. The one that really blew me away was that there does not have to be a buyer necessarily for something to be child sex trafficking. For example, people that are selling or even passing along images of child exploitation, that can be considered trafficking. And that is going to be a new piece of information I pass along to people. And I think we pretty much covered the having to be a parent and loving people unconditionally and loving children unconditionally, as well as the fact that there are virtually zero resources whatsoever for boy or male child sex trafficking. And of course, all of the other genders and sexes that are out there. If you're not a straight girl, you are generally not going to get services, and that is disgusting. Hopefully, these things will change over time as awareness gets out there. But I mean, we really are starting at close to zero, no matter how much people say that there is. The other thing that was shocking in here was the reporting had gone from a fraction of a percent to 7%, which, as I was discussing with Dave, who's here listening right now through cell phone, that in our course we actually talk about it being 6%. So apparently it's NCMEC has it at 7, and this was from last summer. So who knows if it's because there's greater reporting or maybe the numbers are worse, but I'm guessing it has to do with greater reporting and greater awareness of phone numbers that you can actually make a call to. All right, until next time, I'm going to say